Hello, David, and thank you for being with us today. David Graham is a staff writer at The Atlantic, where he covers American politics and is the author of The Project, How Project 2025 is Reshaping America. So, first of all, David, for this international audience, could you give us an overview of what Project 2025 is? And more importantly, why should we care outside of America about what this is saying about democracy?
So Project 2025 was an effort put together by people who were sympathetic to the Trump administration and to Donald Trump, and people who were involved in right-wing politics in the United States in the aftermath of Trump's loss in 2020. And it was partly, they had studied what happened in the first Trump administration, and they felt like it had been a failure, not because of any fault of Trump's necessarily, but because they felt like there hadn't been enough planning. They felt like there hadn't been sort of loyal people to Trump. And so they thought that if they could fix those problems, they could be much more successful. So they put together this plan for what they might do if Trump or another conservative president were to come to power. And so it involves policy ideas, it involves a plan for implementing them, and it also involved a large database of potential loyal staffers. I think this is important because one thing that sets the second Trump administration apart from the first Trump administration is how much more they have been able to get done. They have, not had the sort of piecemeal, improvisational approach to policy we saw from Trump one, but really acted very quickly to knock down a lot of sources of resistance, to take out institutions that might challenge them, and to seize power over the executive branch. I think this is really important, obviously, because of America's role in the world. I think it's also important because it is part of a global right-wing effort. There is a movement to understand what is going on in right-wing governments and right-wing movements everywhere around the world, and to learn lessons and to pass those lessons around. And so in that sense, Project 2025 draws on things that have already happened, and it also meant to impart some of those lessons to their fellow travelers around the world.
Yeah. Could you give us a little overview of the different priority areas that it covers? Um, and I know it has a number of priorities, which are restoring the man-headed family, dismantling the administrative state, closing the border, and securing God-given individual rights. Uh, just give us a background as to why those priorities matter to them and what is the fundamental semantics or ideology at the core, which sort of dictates every single measure they recommend in this plan.
Yeah, all of this flows from what I think we might call Christian nationalism. And that's a tricky term. I think people use it in a lot of different ways, but it's one that some of the people involved in Project 2025 have adopted. And I think, at its most basic, we can say this is an idea of having a country that is based in a very traditionalist vision of Christianity, their particular vision. It's it's about having men who work and women who are at home, large families, these conservative values, and that I think that underlays everything they want to do. The way they want to achieve that is by seizing control of the federal government, a sort of big government approach to right wing values, and to creating a really powerful president, a really powerful executive branch that can make a lot of these things happen and create a kind of long-term shift in the way society works.
But why the executive power? Why should that be so important? And I guess more importantly, why Trump? I mean, he's no saint, three times married, a casino owner, barely ever churched. I mean, if you need a messiah for your movement, is he the best candidate? Uh, you know, that would be my question. So if God is only a cover story, who is this really benefiting? And what's the fundamental intent behind this Christian fundamentalism or nationalism?
Yeah, I mean, I think why the executive branch, the answer is it's the tool at hand. They have studied, the way American government has gone for the last few decades, and they see Congress becoming more and more ineffective. And they also believe that the left has very effectively seized control of a lot of cultural institutions and the bureaucracy and parts of the regulatory state, and they want to sort of seize power back from that. As for why Trump, I mean, I think that's a really good question, and you're exactly right. He is not a natural fit for them personally. I think many of them would have made more sense with other Republican candidates, but they see in Trump someone who's able to do these things. Unlike other Republicans, He's willing to tear down a lot of the structures. He's willing to sort of burn it to the ground. And he also has sway over conservative voters and over conservative office holders, Republican office holders, that allows him to get things done that I think no other Republican would have been able to do. So for them, he's sort of a useful tool. He's not their endpoint, but he is the method they have to getting started with the project that they want to make happen.
Yeah, because this is not the first mandate. It's a very long tradition. I think it's edition 9 or 10, right? Um, and they weren't sure that, Trump would be their poster boy, I guess, when they started writing. But would you say that the way it's been implemented since 2025 is, really aligned with what their original idea was? Or is it more something that has, been modified by Trump and, through maybe what is a cult of his personality as a leader, this very populist, person? What is the difference between the intent and the implementation in the end?
I think it's been a mixed bag. Some things they've been very successful at and others less. Um, the place where I think they've had the greatest success is in this sort of seizing control of the government, politicizing the Justice Department, seizing control of regulatory agencies, sidelining Congress. All of these are places where Trump really has enhanced his power along the lines that they have laid out. Um, where that breaks down into policies, I think where you get some of the more mixed bag. We've seen Trump do some of the things they wanted, a tax on diversity or a tax on universities. What we haven't seen is kind of a really, truly, the kind of family policy they talk about. We don't see really aggressive moves on abortion from the administration. We don't see pro-natalist policies, these things that seem to be really important to them, these really socially conservative views. And then, as we speak, I think the really important place where they have not managed to push things is um, in foreign affairs, where Trump has, instead of having a very inwardly focused, quasi-isolationist view, obviously he's going around the world starting wars, most particularly in Iran. He's going to China on a relatively friendly visit where they would like to see him confronting China. And so in these senses, it seems like they've given him the power, but they've lost a little bit of grip on the policy agenda itself.
Now, on Iran, I read through the parts on Iran, and it seems like they had already spelt it out. The authors of this mandate for leadership is in particular identifying Iran as a threat and the imperative of the energy source there that had to be sort of escalated. The only solutions left were either to escalate through economic threats and eventually military punishment, or nothing. Iran had to accept and comply in a sense. So I think it was written, but what they hadn't anticipated is probably the Hormuz consequences and where we're at now, and nor had Trump, obviously. But if you could please give us a very sort of detailed image or description of what Trump's America, if he were to fulfill every single one of those prescriptions, what would it look like? Because I get a sense that if you're white, male, Christian, born in the US, rich, you're fine and dandy. But if you're the opposite of that, it's you're on your own. It's really tough. What do you make of it? How can you give us a really detailed description?
Yeah, I think you've started in a really good place. I think that is right. The goal is very much to have these Christian values, to have a very masculine dominated world, um, for men to be breadwinners and for men to have control. They would like to close off the United States effectively, to make it much harder for people to enter the United States, so to sort of maintain the ethnic balance as it exists now. And not only that, but to maybe move backwards a little bit. There's an effort not just to secure the borders, as they say, but really to get people who are already in the country to leave. And that's not just people who are here without the authorization. It's also people who are here on valid visas, people who have entered the country legally, but who they'd like to get to leave, whether that's through denaturalization or revoking visas, things like that. They would like to have the way things operate in the U.S. be on a much more religious basis. So that means undermining public schools, and moving towards more religious schooling or private schooling, but particularly religious schooling, having religious values taught in the schools. They'd like to move social services towards religious organizations, to take the state out of the business of providing the kind of welfare benefits, or to have them run through the state, but still with religious education involved. They'd like to have larger families. To sort of fill this hole of not having immigration, you have to create a state that is robust through higher birth rates. Um, Dismantle civil rights protections that are existing, which is something we've seen them make a fair amount of progress on. Cut taxes for the wealthy, move towards a flat tax that would be much more regressive than the existing tax system. Reduce environmental regulation, make it much easier to drill for oil and drill for gas, while reducing the kinds of safety and anti-pollution measures that we have. It really is across the board, eliminating a lot of the hallmarks of the 21st century American life.
It sounds dystopian. I mean, how can that be good? And I guess how can it appeal to a very broad electorate? Because they cannot just be elected by the few white men who are rich enough to like these policies, right?
And I
So
think the
how
answer
do
is
they
it's not
appeal?
popular. It isn't popular. And it's interesting, even in 2024, the Heritage Foundation did some polling on Project 2025. And they found, despite the fact that this is a pretty, detailed, wonky report, most of the voters in swing states who they polled were familiar with it and they didn't like it. But there's also polling from the 2024 election where voters said they hated Project 2025, but they simply didn't believe that Trump would do these things. They thought either he wouldn't follow through or that they were too extreme to do. The people behind it, I think, understand this. They know that what they're doing is not popular, but they are also, they have this very apocalyptic worldview. They believe that the U.S. is on the verge of Marxist takeover, that the Constitution is faltering, and if they, there's godlessness around the corner. If they don't act now, if they don't take these drastic measures, America, as they know it and love it, is going to slip from their hands. So they're willing to do things that are unpopular, things that might create backlash. And I think their hope is that they can create a country where people will be brought into more of these conservative values and they will come to support it. But they also know that there will be backlash. And they, that's one reason their goal, I think, has been to move as fast as possible in the last 15, 16 months because they know the backlash is coming and they know that they have to act before people have a chance to stop them.
Right. Which is why this mandate for leadership is a very sort of how-to manual of how to get the ball and start running on day one, of who to hire, what exactly to do, which executive order. The spelling has been taken literally from the Project 2025 and applied since day one of the Trump administration. Which is very scary, and begs the question: do people actually know about this? Have you seen any polls of how many people might have been aware of the voters of Trump, aware of this plan
I think there was
beforehand?
some awareness, but I think I think there was not, and I would count myself in this. We, the press, as well as I think opponents of Trump, did not do a good job of understanding this plan and of spreading word about it before the election. My my interaction with it was I've seen reports, things like this. To my eye, are things that happen every 4 years, and I thought it was the typical kind of policy wish list. I didn't
Uh-huh.
understand how carefully they laid out methods of doing what they wanted to do.
Yeah.
I also approached it as a series of policies sort of apart from each other. And it was only when I read it through cover to cover that I started to grasp just how complete a worldview it was. So I think the press didn't do a good job of communicating that to voters. I think Democrats didn't do a good job of communicating that to voters. They pointed to specific policies, or they made claims, about Social Security cuts, for example, that weren't in there. And once the administration started, it seems like the Democratic Party was sometimes taken by surprise by these things. So I don't think that understanding was there, and I do hold myself partly responsible for that.
Well, don't blame yourself too much. I would put that on, the onus is on the Democratic Party, I guess. I mean, to this day, they don't seem to be acting upon it still. Like, why aren't we now already anticipating the next measure? That's really an open question. Um, so, I today was reading the newspaper, and I came across an expression which really resonated and reminded or made me think of Project 25, which was techno-authoritarian capitalism. Do you see a collusion between the big tech and big American corporations that might be this sort of power behind, who see a vested interest in Project 2025 coming to fruition?
Yeah, and I think this is a place where the tech establishment has kind of outflanked some of the authors of Project 2025. There is, for the authors, many of the authors have a real skepticism of technology
Mm.
for a variety of reasons. Some of that is they're worried that the big tech companies are bastions of liberalism. Some of that is they're worried that the big tech companies are too close to China or too reliant on China. Some of it is they worried that things like social media and phones are bad for children and they're bad for social, kind of social values that they want. But what's happened is the tech companies have outflanked them. They quickly moved to fawn over Trump, to curry favor with him, even before he entered office. And so the result is you have a Trump with the authoritarian powers that Project 2025 has given him, but at the same time, kind of in the pocket of tech or allied with tech. So the tech companies have managed to get sort of grab themselves onto that power. Um, and I think for the tech companies, the agenda here, as pertains to race and class and Christianity, they're happy to go along with that as long as they are making money. They're happy to sort of accommodate themselves to whatever the regime is. In an ironic way, it's a bit of an echo of what the Project 2025 authors said. They were warned that Silicon Valley was too ready to accommodate itself to China's authoritarian system. And what we see is it's also perfectly capable of accommodating itself to authoritarianism in the United States too.
Mm. Yeah, interesting. Um, you mentioned race, and interestingly, I just wonder, why are they so racist? What is the point? I mean, when I see the patriarchal family system fits with their Christian values, fair enough, but why are we anti-race?
I think they would argue they're not racist, and they would say that they are colorblind. This is the same sort of rhetoric that we saw out of the Supreme Court on the voting rights decision. They say these things are colorblind. I think a lot of this comes down to the idea expressed often by J.D. Vance that America is not about or less about the Constitution or the values of the Declaration of Independence, and what it is about a cultural lineage. It's about
Mhm.
Anglo-Saxon or Scotch-Irish values. And so in that sense, they say we're not focused on race, we're focused on values, and anything we can do to do these values is important. And so they would say, we want to bring minorities into the values. We want to inculcate these values in the minority community through the methods that we propose. But in practice, what they also want to do is to roll back many of the protections and advances of the civil rights era under the name of pushing back on wokeness. So it's a tension I think they don't recognize, but is very much present.
Yeah, there seems to be a constant tension or contradiction in what they say. On the one hand, they want to reduce a federal government to its bare bones because they see it as too politicized. But on the other, they want to accrue all the power to the executive branch and make every single civil servant a political appointee. So how does that solve the problem? Same thing with, they want to make it all in defense of individual liberties, and yet we are reducing rights of voters, of expression, of everything. So how do you see that they are aware of this contradiction throughout their mandate for leadership?
It's not clear to me how aware they are. They definitely speak the language of liberty. They speak the language of small government, but they want to give more power to government to crack down on citizens, and they want to certainly roll back some liberties. There's a really fascinating quote in the document from the president of the Heritage Foundation, and he says that he talks about the freedom to do not as we want, but as we ought. So it's a
Yeah.
freedom very much circumscribed by these religious values, and it's determined by them. Over and over, they say that they don't want to politicize, but in practice, what I think their ideas show is they simply want to politicize in a different way. They are not concerned that the government be neutral. They want the government to be right wing, and if it's doing that, they're perfectly content with uh, you know, a, a, a very muscular government.
Mm. Basically, you're free to do as I say, in
Right,
short.
exactly. It's not a libertarian. So, I mean, I think this is an interesting shift from the Heritage Foundation has been traditionally much more aligned with a kind of Ronald Reagan conservatism.
Mm.
And there's certainly critiques to be made of that, including on race, including on gender. But I think there was at least a sense in Reagan conservatism that a large and powerful government was a problem. And that is an idea that has been thrown out here. There is no real libertarianism in Project 2025.
Scary. Have you been taking stock of the implementation of the measures announced to this day? I mean, VDEM, you might have heard, published a report recently of democracy, tracking democracy across 179 countries. And US dropped from 20th to 51st place, which is a 24 drop, the steepest on the record. Um, which is scary. Ever since Trump took office for the second time, we're now ranking close to India, Mexico, and countries where we thought it was not exactly democracies or not fully democracies. So we're now an electoral democracy, according to VDEM. Have you been seeing rights crumbling? Have you been measuring that yourself in terms of the measures that are implemented? I ran it through ChatGPT, and it said that about 42% were durably implemented, 28% were in motion, and 30% had been blocked, which is scary because we're only in year one, right? There are 3 more years left, so they're on course. Do you think we're on course for them to succeed in implementing this agenda?
Yeah, I have not quantified it myself, and I've seen tallies. I mean, I think that is a pretty good approximation. I've seen some other tallies in the same general area. And I think it's tough to quantify, partly because some of the things that they want to do are very large, and some of them, what they want to do are relatively narrow and small. And so it's hard to figure out how to weight them against each other. Um, but I think they have made a ton of progress. I think they've made more progress so far, maybe than they anticipated. And many of the things they're doing now are, I think, laying the groundwork for more moves later on. So, for example, we see the Trump administration working to take over power of regulatory agencies, to get rid of that independence. That has taken time. It's moving through the courts. It seems like they will have a final decision from the Supreme Court sometime soon in their favor. Once that happens, they will be able to use those agencies to great effect to achieve many more of the things they want to do. And so it's looming over us. They will be that once that single thing is done, it will allow a lot of other things. And I think the progress on that is moving fast. I also think they're looking at the midterm elections, and that could be a problem for them. A Democratic Congress or even a Democratic House would create a little bit of a roadblock. But they've also spent the first couple of years of the administration trying to get around Congress, trying to build structure so they don't have to rely on Congress. And so that will allow them to keep doing the things they want to do, even if they do poorly in the midterm elections.
Do you think this track record could serve as an inspiration to other authoritarian wannabes globally? I've heard Kevin Roberts mention Orban in Hungary. He apparently was involved in the writing of this project 2025, even though it's not mentioned in itself, in the document itself. To what extent do you think there has been influence from outside of the US and vice versa? To what extent will the US influence other countries?
I think this is very much part of a global project. There are people on the global right learning from each other and passing lessons around. So Orban, I think, is a great example. American conservatives are besotted with Orban. We have seen them going to Hungary. We saw J.D. Vance, of course, go to Hungary in an ill-fated attempt just before the
Yeah.
election to help Orban. And we saw real laments from a lot of people on the American right after his defeat. Um, but I think those ideas are very much embedded in this report. And I think JD Vance, even more than Trump, is a true believer in the kind of Project 2025 agenda. So I think that's worth noting. We've also seen Vance speak up, for example, for AfD in Germany. We've seen closeness with Reform in Britain. We've seen ties with Bardella in France. We've seen Trump using tariffs to try to, uh, uh, you know, sort of slap back at the Lula government in Brazil for charging Jair Bolsonaro. So, you see these connections. All of these groups are connected. They want to see what works and they want to pass those lessons around, and, to subsidize each other financially, but also sort of subsidize each other intellectually.
So what would be your recommendation to European voters or international voters for that matter? What lessons can one draw from the Trump experiment to date? Yeah, what can we do to counter-arrest it?
These are great questions, and I wish I had a really simple answer. People ask me what to do in the United States, and I don't know. I think there's a few things. One is be aware. As you asked earlier about this awareness, and I think Americans were taken a bit by surprise by it. They didn't believe. They either didn't know what was in it, or they simply didn't believe that Trump would do these things. So I think, the U.S. can be a bit of an example to people. Um, Let's see. I think also an important thing to recognize from the U.S. experience is that there are a lot of that a lot of the guardrails and a lot of the structures that we expect to hold to keep things sort of in the middle aren't as strong as we think. So, we traditionally around the world you get a left wing government or a right wing government, but they're going to act within a certain band of what is acceptable. I think that's no longer the case. They're no longer bound by that kind of propriety. And in the US, there have been a lot of informal rules or practices that seem like they were solid. But it turns out if you have a government that's willing to simply ignore them, which is what we've seen from Trump, there's not a lot to stop them. There aren't necessarily legal structures that will stop them. So I think the importance of having strong checks and balances, having courts that act independently, having other bodies, legislatures or regulators that act independently from the state, I think that is really important. And I think that's something the U.S. is going to need to focus whenever this is over on creating a stronger Congress, a Congress that is more functional than it has been, because the failure of Congress to really work, I think for decades now, is very much something that has empowered Trump. And to fix these things, it would require a stronger Congress.
And ironically, that's precisely one of the things that Project 2025 is trying to do, which is to strengthen the checks and balances of Congress, which I find quite ironic, wouldn't you say?
Oh, how do you mean? I mean, I think they would like to undermine Congress. I think they want to move Congress to the side, rather than giving them any power.
I mean, I came across a sentence by Kevin Roberts saying that the problem, I think it was in a New York Times interview, actually, where he was saying that the problem is that Congress is ineffectual and it should be strengthened.
Oh, right. I mean,
Um,
they say this. I think that's true. They do say it, but I don't think they mean it. They're right to say that Congress is ineffectual. Um, but their answer to that, despite their rhetoric, is then to make it much easier for the president to go around Congress. So, this is these places where they're not totally honest about their aims, but also I think they're very much they're correct in some of their diagnoses about the failures of the system. But rather than seeing those as things to be fixed, they see them as weaknesses to be exploited.
right. Do you see any major failure of Trump as being sort of an element of hope for us in the future for us to recover? Because when you look at all the measures that are implemented to date and this power of the machinery of disinformation and propaganda, it is scary, and one sort of sees already the effect of downgrading democracy in the United States. Is, for instance, the Iran war, a mistake that that he will not recover from?
Boy, I hate to make predictions about Trump because he has defied my guesses before. But I do think that, like, if you look at the unpopularity of the Iran war, or you look at the unpopularity of his economic agenda, or you look at even the disapproval of immigration, something that he ran on that was always an asset for him. Most Americans disapprove of his handling of immigration now.
Mm.
And I think that is the problem for him. So many of these things he has either failed to deliver. He claimed he would stop inflation. He's made it worse. He claimed he would stay out of foreign wars. He has gotten us embroiled in one. So these places, and I think those things undermine him, and I think that makes it easier for Republicans to say no to him, easier for Democrats to win elections. And I also think it disappoints a lot of voters. There were voters who believed that, whatever else they might think about Trump, he would do things differently. They didn't like the way the system was working and they thought he would tear it down. And what they're seeing is he is in some ways a lot like all the other politicians, and in other ways not. He really is cutting into the services that they want. So I think he is a little bit discrediting himself, and I think that will make it harder for his allies in the Project 2025 world to maintain a grip on power, and also to elect someone who is their champion in 2028 or in the future.
Yeah. All right. Do you have anything else you'd like to add? Any reflections as to how you're left after writing this book and thinking about it long and hard?
It is, I think, it's been a very strange experience, and I think if anything, as I look at the results in Hungary, as I look at polling ahead of the midterm elections, um, I I think there are signs of voters rejecting this kind of right wing populism, and I think there are signs of the resilience of some of the systems in place. They're battered, they're damaged, but they're not necessarily gone. So those things I think are signs for hope. But I do, I think there's going to be a really huge project of trying to build something new when this is over. It's not a matter of going back to the way things were. Those structures have been destroyed, and I think, uh, you know, people in the United States and in other countries need to think about what can work and what they can build new, to avoid these kinds of failures. And that is a very big project. And I think we need to be thinking about it already.
Yeah. Quite a bit of this is irreversible, I fear. And I'm not sure how much we will be able to fix of what's left of American democracy. But maybe with time. I mean, we recovered from Nazi Germany, so there's hope. Thank you very much for your time, David. It was a pleasure.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
Take care.